All right, great. All right, kicking things off. Thanks for joining us, everyone. We're presenting some pre-conference talk content before DEF CON 30. We're part of the Project Obsidian project that the Blue Team Village is involved with to create content for the community. And this is the Cyber Threat Intelligence station. And we're going to kick it off with Module 1, Foundations of CTI. So we are going to release this before DEF CON 30 in prep for the CTI station sessions taking place in Vegas. So this module will cover the objectives, and we'll go over the terminology, some terminology and definitions, get everyone on the same page. Have an overview of what cyber threat intelligence is, and we'll get into types of CTI. We'll go over the CTI Lifecycle as well, which we'll use pretty heavily throughout the different sessions, and we'll touch base on what a collection management framework is and how it can be used. So with that, so the objective. So really just to review the foundations of CTI, right? It is a nuanced topic. There's a lot to be discussed. And there are different applications of threat intelligence as well. So it is important that we share the common understanding of terminology, concepts, and goals and objectives of cyber threat intelligence. So that's the objective. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Stephanie here for terminology and definitions.
Great. So we're going to go over a couple of definitions here just to get everyone on the same page. Sometimes some words have different meanings from different sources. So we'll start off with what is CTI. CTI stands for Cyber Threat Intelligence. It's analyzed information on malicious intent, opportunity, or capability of an adversary. Usually it satisfies some kind of requirements like stakeholder or customer requirements. Moving on to intelligence requirement, that's like the driving question. That's the core of the intelligence lifecycle, like what are we trying to answer? And moving on, the adversary or the threat, we use these interchangeably. This is the person involved in the attack or intrusion. Vulnerabilities and tools don't fall under the adversary or threat definition. An intrusion, that's an attempt by the adversary to compromise the system. Doesn't have to succeed, just an attempt. An activity group, that's a grouping of intrusions that have something in common. So it could be infrastructure, same victim, same adversary, etc. That meets some kind of analytical requirement. A threat actor, that's a threat that's responsible for an intrusion that's tracked across different intrusions. So you can group intrusions based on identity of the threat actor. Campaign or operation, that's the adversary's mission. TLP, that stands for Traffic Light Protocol. We'll go over that a bit more later. The victim, that is the individual or network or system that is compromised during the threat actor's mission. The target is the intended victim of the intrusion, so they're not always the same. A persona, that could be a fake name or identifier that the adversary uses as a disguise. TTP, that stands for Tactics, Techniques, and Procedures, and we'll have an example of that later. And finally, tradecraft, that is capabilities, methods, resources that the adversary uses. It's broader than TTPs. So here we have something called the pyramid of pain. So this is like categorization of different IOCs. IOCs are indicators of compromise. So how easy are they to change by the adversary? So let's say like an IP address, you find a malicious IP address. it's great. You can track that across your system, but it's very easy for the IP address to change. So the higher up the pyramid of pain you go, if you find like a tool they're using or network artifacts, then it's a lot less likely the adversary is going to be able to change that very quickly. And we'll talk a bit also about IOC pivoting. So like I said, IOC is an indicator of compromise. Could be like a malicious hash, malicious IP, etc. So pivoting is when you use one IOC to find out more data or information about an intrusion. So it can be performed on like a host or network artifacts, and you can get more intelligence out of this. So some of the outcomes you might see are learning more about the adversary's infrastructure or what they're capable of, identifying like a malware family, for example, or attributing like some malware you found to an adversary, like maybe you find out that they're connected in some way, or identifying more IOCs that are related to the campaign. And we're moving on to an example here, an example TTP. So remember that stands for tactics, techniques, and procedures. So this is kind of like a broad to narrow scope view. So you start out with a tactic, which is like a high level tradecraft. So for example, you compromise a domain controller to get passwords. That's what the adversary did. And then you move on to the specific technique they used to do that. So how did they accomplish the tactic? So they leveraged exploit Y to compromise the domain controller. That's a technique. And you can go down even deeper to the procedure, the specific approach they used to accomplish the technique. So like exactly what commands they used to leverage the exploit, for example. And we'll also move on here to a little bit more in depth in the traffic light protocol. So TLP. So you have 4 different color codes for this. They're each different ways of classifying information, actually. So for sharing. So if you have intelligence that's shared and it's TLP red, this means you shouldn't share it outside of the original meeting it was disclosed at. So exchange in person or verbally only usually. And if it's shared outside, it could cause harm or additional damage to the organization. And then here, as you go down the color codes, it gets less restrictive. So you have a TLP amber. You can share it with members inside your own org or clients that are directly affected, but don't share it outside of that. Otherwise, it, again, may cause more harm to the organization. And then green can be shared across orgs with other peers in the industry, but not on public channels. And then a TLP white can be distributed with no restrictions. So these are just information classification. And I'll hand it back over to Clay for a CTI overview.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, the goal of this section really is to provide a general understanding of cyber threat intelligence. And the first slide here demonstrates how data can be turned into action. Data, for example, IOCs are all different types of data, right? An IP address is just a data point. URLs, domains, file hashes, etc., are all data. Information, as we go up the pyramid here, adds a little bit more context with that piece of data. So, for example, this IP address is a C2 for this malware. So as you see, we have some information there. It's more than just an IP address. We have some context, a little bit more context around it. Now getting up to intelligence, for example, we could say that we found that the adversary wasn't specifically targeting our organization. The intrusion was incidental. So this is based on data and information and further analysis. So that's really how we can go from data to intelligence. Really like this diagram here because it points out the different phases of the CTI lifecycle that these components take place in, right? So analysis and production, that leads us to the knowledge, wisdom, or intelligence, which can then lead to action, right? So love this slide or this diagram. And thank you, Valentina, for your book and using that resource. Additional topics that we're not going to cover in this module, perhaps later modules, but really good stuff to be aware of. The first one here is Sherman Kent and the profession of intelligence analysis, and the psychology of intelligence analysis by Richard J. Herr Jr. He gets into some good topics like tools for thinking, cognitive biases, and improving intelligence analysis. So great paper, highly recommend. Here's some more information on bias. It's, I think, a critical topic for threat intelligence analysts, but also anyone in cybersecurity, to be honest. SOC analysts can benefit from this as well. So being able to identify and defeat bias is really a critical skill to develop and is not limited to CTI. So here's some additional resources. And I'm not advancing slides. Apologies for that. But here you go. Here are the links to these resources here. Yep. And so the Diamond Model for Intrusion Analysis, another big one, the Lockheed Martin Cyber Kill Chain and MITRE ATT&CK Navigator, all things we're going to reference and use throughout the different modules for the CTI station here, and just really must know content. So by all means, here's a link to the resources. Go check them out and dig in. So I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Stephanie.
Cool. So we're going to go over the types of CTI. So there's 3 broad categories for CTI. They're categorized by objectives and audience for the most part. So we'll again start at like the most technical layer and move up the hierarchy. So the first type you have is tactical intelligence. The objective for that is getting the technical details of threats to detect and prevent them. So like indicators of compromise, like IP addresses, hashes of malware, etc. And the people interested in this intelligence would be like SOC analysts, your tools like a SIM, firewall, endpoints, intrusion detection system, places where you can write rules to detect these things based on the intelligence. So tactical intelligence, it focuses really on like the immediate future, like how do we block these things now as soon as possible. It's very technical in nature. Again, it might identify simple IOCs and provides information about the tactics, techniques, and procedures the adversary is using. It's the easiest type of intelligence to consume. You can usually get this automated from different feeds, like free data feeds, open source data feeds, your logs, etc. But has a very limited lifespan. Like these things might change very quickly. So it's really focused on the immediate future. And moving on, we have operational intelligence. So operational intelligence is more about tracking a campaign or a threat actor profile to get a better understanding of who the adversaries are. So the people interested in this might be, again, SOC analysts, but also people like threat hunters, people doing vulnerability management, incident response, or security management. So we really want to know like why, who, how, like who is usually called attribution. So like who can we attribute this campaign to? Who might be behind it? Why are they behind it? Like the motivation or intent, and how are they running this campaign? So that's usually made up of the TTPs. last type of intelligence here we have is strategic intelligence. So this is to inform business decisions. The people interested in that might be the C-suite, executive board, security management. So really like the leadership, they're interested in this. It's usually piecing together like the impact of high-level factors like foreign policy, global events, international movements. This kind of intelligence, it's usually generated as a report for the leadership team to take in and make business decisions on. But it's also the hardest to create because there's not really an automated way to create this intelligence. It requires a lot of manual data collection and analysis, along with expertise in both security and like geopolitics. And I'll turn it back to Lucid for CTI Lifecycle.
Thank you. As you can see here, we have a diagram, and it shows that intelligence is both a process and a product. And it can be divided into this 6-phase cycle as you go around: planning and direction, preparation and collection, processing, analysis and production, dissemination, and feedback and evaluation. Each one of those items in the cycle, each phase has its own characteristics. There's challenges to each of them, and each one can actually have its own level of maturity. And actually later in the slides, we'll show a model for the maturity of this CTI cycle. And this life cycle is iterative, and it allows you to have this adaptable methodology that has all of these, that goes through these 6 phases. And ultimately, this cycle converts the raw data that you start with into an actual CTI product. Let's see. So the first phase, planning and direction, this is where you set your goals and objectives. And you're doing things like identifying what assets do we have, what processes do we have that could be interrupted. How are we going to end up? How does the organization get targeted? What the security concerns of the different departments or stakeholders are, what their questions are, and ending up prioritizing mitigations. What are and based on what the actual threats are to the organization. And this program will develop. It'll become more mature over time. And you keep going through this cycle, and it improves itself. And it helps the company to adjust, or the organization adjusts to an ever-changing threat landscape that it faces. Right, so preparation and collection is where you gather the information together that satisfies the intelligence requirements that have already been defined. And there's different methods to doing this. You could do several different things to collect information, including pulling in metadata and logs, things that aren't technical, like holding conversations, finding people to interview that are knowledgeable about your infrastructure, or knowledgeable about threat intelligence, or things like infiltrating closed sources, finding out information from dark web forums, and this is raw data. This data will be collected and combined with other products, like adversary reports, malware hashes, IP addresses, and it will help to enrich that data. And processing is where you take all of that you've collected, and you're trying to get it into a format that's actually usable by the organization. It has to be processed in some way, whether that's by a human, whether that's by a machine, and data might have to be correlated or ranked. You get to get rid of some of the duplicate information, or verify that it's legitimate or correct, or it's not a false positive. An example of this is pulling IP addresses from a security report. and then adding them to a CSV file, maybe putting that into your SIM platform. With this data information intelligence that you put together, exports could be produced, and you can start to create reporting that could be ready for dissemination. An analysis is where a human actually turns the information from the previous step into intelligence that can actually be used, operationalized by all of their stakeholders. And it's going to vary the format that ends up being in, what you try to communicate. If you're trying to communicate with non-technical leaders, you have to be concise. Don't use confusing terms, jargon, technical terms. Talk about what the actual impact things are in business terms, what the impact is, what the costs are. Is it going to hurt the company's reputation? And you have to include an actual recommended course of action, because that's the questions that leaders want to know. What do we do? Okay, that information you just gave me is great. The intelligence you're giving me is great, but what do we do? And then dissemination. With this phase, this is where the intelligence is actually delivered to those stakeholders. And you have to ask some questions at this phase. What threat intelligence do the stakeholders need? How can it be presented to them that in a way that they can actually use it? How can they follow up with you and ask questions? And that leads into the feedback and evaluation that follows right after that. And this is challenging, but it's critical to the success of the program. And this is where you're creating processes where you can get feedback from the stakeholders, whether it was useful to them. And it really makes the team able to determine whether this cycle is effective and whether it has positive outcomes. I will turn it back over to Clay to talk about the CTI Lifecycle Maturity Matrix.
All right, thank you, Lucid. So I put this together to really demonstrate how a CTI program can mature over time using the CTI lifecycle. Each and every phase can represents its own level of maturity. And each phase presents opportunities for improvement and can be a different level of maturity than the phase before or after it. For example, collection. One thing that many organizations do is they identify an IOC threat feed or two, and they start consuming that data and they process it. They usually kick it out to a SIM. There's usually some sort of sweeping of the environment for these IOCs. If there are any hits, that can be triaged and investigated. It's a good first step. That's not an intelligence program, far from it, but that's every good intelligence program should probably be doing that, right? It just makes sense. It's a good first step, and I would certainly classify that as the initial level of maturity for collection. It can grow and expand from there, right? Collecting data from different sources, etc. So put this together to demonstrate that a CTI program can use this model, this matrix, as a way to assess their level of maturity. And you can set goals for the next 12 to 24 months on if your collection is initial and you want to get to the defined level, you can set that as a goal and you're off and running. You can start making those developments and improvements over time and get there, right? So wanted to touch base on this. If you have any questions, let me know. So the final section here is collection management framework. So creating a collection management framework, or CMF, should be one of the first things to do when building a CTI program. It should be viewed as a living document that's consistently updated on an ongoing basis. Whenever there's new sources of data, add them and include what type of data is included. So here's an example of different sources external to the organization for malware analysis. There are different, the columns represent the different data points that are available. This is just a simple example for demonstration purposes here, but at a glance, you can see, all right, well, IPs are found through all of these. That's great. So there's redundancy there. First seen and last seen, 2 out of the 4 only have it. So we're probably going to want to stick with those data sources. Reverse DNS, just for this example, virus total includes it, but the others don't. So if that's a data point that's important for you, you're going to want to make sure you keep that data source. So this is a great way to identify any gaps you might have as well. And again, update it on an ongoing basis. And here's an example of not necessarily malware data sources, but internal sources of data. So this can be used by many teams, right? Threat hunting teams can identify where they might be able to find certain pieces of information that they're looking for, or certain data points. So this can help map out their threat hunt and where they're going to look. The kill chain coverage, that's a nice feature to have there too. So you can see, you can say, well, depending on the how far along the attack has progressed, you know where you might be able to find certain artifacts and can search those locations. Can also provide a sort of a strategic approach to future investments and how they should be prioritized based on your coverage, based on your visibility, based on your intelligence requirements. That's driving all of this. So yeah, collection management framework should be one of the first things organizations do, and keeping it up to date, right? Which can be a challenge, but work it into your workflow. Revisit it every 6 months. Do we need to make any adjustments? No, we're good. All right, good to go. We'll revisit it in 6 more months. So that covers everything in Module 1. So thank you. And by all means, join the conversation. Here's a link to our Discord. We will have Project Obsidian Discord channels set up pretty soon that are publicly available. So drop in, ask questions, join the conversation. And thanks again. And we look forward to future modules.